Nvidia launched the RTX 5050 on July 1st, 2025, and this is an interesting card because we didn't have a 4050, but we had a 3050. We didn't have a 2050, but we had a 1650, and we also had the 1050 if you go way back when, 950 back in the day. So this is the first true budget desktop GPU in 4 years. How does it fare? We'll get to that later. Let's start with the card itself though. I picked up off of Newegg an Asus Dual RTX 5050. It's because it was basically the cheapest RTX 5050 and I would prefer Asus over like the MSI. It had a slightly higher factory overclock. It's still a no frills card, no RGB lighting or anything like that. Two relatively small fans, but they do have an integrated rim that helps with static pressure and airflow. Card design is fine overall. Got the metal backplate, single 8-pin power connector. We don't need any of the 16-pin nonsense on a budget card. And it does have the full-length by 16 slot connector, even though only 8 lanes are connected for data, which provides support, unlike that crappy Gigabyte 5060 Ti that I bought. Yeah, that was a mistake, but it still performs okay. Triple DisplayPort 2.1b, 80 gigabits per second, UHBR20, and then a single HDMI 2.1b as well, with 56 gigabits per second. Basically what you would expect from an entry-level GPU. Let's talk specs quickly though. This is where things get a little interesting. So this is a $250 card. The step up to the 5060 is $50 more. That's a 20% increase in price. Well, the 5050 comes with 20 streaming multiprocessors, SMs, which means you get 128 CUDA cores per SM, so 2560 CUDA cores versus 30 SMs on the 5060. That's a 50% increase. Now the 5050 does have slightly higher clock speeds, and the Asus card, like I said, it's factory overclocked, but it's not going to close a 50% gap. It's going to maybe make it to 40 to 45% gap on compute. The RTX 5050 also has GDDR6 memory running at 20 gigatransfers per second. The 5060 and above, they all use GDDR7 memory running at 28 gigatransfers per second. It's actually 30 on the 5080, but that's a different story. Almost 50% more performance for the 5060 is what we're really talking about. Probably 40 to 50% in a lot of situations for 20% more money. That right there makes the RTX 5050 a non-starter in my opinion. And yet I bought one because, hey, let's see how it performs, right? I did pay my own money for this card. Thanks, Asus. You didn't send it to me. I get to say whatever I want. No extra frills like RGB lighting, but you still get the dual BIOS switch between performance and quiet modes. So that is like an extra. I'm not saying this is a garbage card. It's just the baseline cheapest Asus card that they make. It's not the Strix. It's not even the tough gaming. It's just the Dual. That's about enough on the card itself. The 3050 was the last budget, like XX50 class card from Nvidia 4 years ago. It also had 20 SMs, but they clocked a lot lower. They don't have the architectural enhancements of Ada or Blackwell, so there should be a pretty good gap between the 3050 and the 5050, which brings us to the benchmarks. I've got 1080p medium, 1080p Ultra, and 1440p Ultra results. And then because I know 1440p Ultra is not a realistic setting for a $250 card, so I'm going to enable Nvidia's DLSS and we'll show you what it can do. I am going all out though on the upscaling. I'm not using Ultra Performance mode, but I am using the Performance mode. So 4x upscaling. Rendering at 720p, upscaling to 1440p, and I dropped the settings to high. Those will be in the 1440p charts, but let's start with 1080p medium. We find kind of what you would expect looking at the specifications and other details. It's pretty much tied with the RTX 4060. So it's $50 less than what the 4060 cost and delivers about the same performance. It's a pretty sizable jump, 60% faster than the old 3050 8 gig. Notice that it's also slightly faster than the ARC B580, which is interesting because the B580 has 12 gig and a 192-bit interface, whereas we've got 8 gig and a 128-bit interface. More L2 cache on the 5050, I believe it has 24 megabytes. I can't find hard data on that yet, but I know the 5060 has 32 megabytes, and I'm pretty sure the 5050 only has 24 megabytes. It's made with the smaller GB207 chip, whereas the 5060 and 5060 Ti use the GB206. Obviously not going to touch the 5060 Ti or the 9060 XT that competes with those, but the 5060, what is that? About 25% faster? Not as big of a gap as maybe the specs would seem to suggest, but we're at 1080p medium. So let's kick up to 1080p ultra. And here the 5060 now is a bigger jump in performance. That's not good for the 5050. So if you're paying 20% more and getting 31% more performance, you should buy the more expensive card, generally speaking. But they're still both 8 gig cards, so I don't love that. The Arc B580, 12 gig seems to help out more at 1080p ultra settings. But drivers are a problem with Arc still, and we'll see that in the game charts. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but we'll get to those momentarily. Finally, let's just look at the 1440p numbers. Obviously, there's that top line I'll get to in a second, but 29 frames per second. We've dropped below 30 FPS on average. Lots of games aren't going to hit 30. Some of the games I test will break 30, but in general, maybe half of them are truly playable is what I would say, and I would want more performance. Well, how do you get more performance? Hey, what about this DLSS tech? Running the high settings instead of ultra, which reduces the memory requirements, and then we're using 4x upscaling, so we're rendering at 720p. You would think that would look terrible, but DLSS does a really good job of upscaling, and so it doesn't look as bad as you might expect. And really, we're going from 30-ish frames per second to 72 frames per second. 2.5 times almost the performance. It's a worthwhile trade-off to consider. I'm not going to say it looks the same as 1440p native, but for the smoothness of gameplay, if you can only afford a $250 card, the 5050 starts to look a lot better. All the other Nvidia cards would get a similar boost in performance though, so don't think that 5050 high plus DLSS competes directly against 5060 Ti 16 gig running native at ultra settings, because that's not the same. You could turn the settings to high and you could turn on DLSS, and the 5060 Ti would also see like that 2.5x boost in performance. Playable for sure on a 5050 if you're willing to use performance mode upscaling. You could even drop to balanced mode and do 3x mode upscaling, and then maybe it's like 60 frames per second. Quality mode, gonna drop below 60, but quality mode at 1440p looks really quite nice in my opinion. So viable option. You can turn on frame generation and in some games multi-frame generation. You'll sacrifice some latency of input in order to get higher frames per second, but they're not all the same type of frames. So like if we're getting 72 frames per second with DLSS upscaling, you turn on MFG 4X, so multi-frame generation 4X mode, maybe you bump up to 150 frames per second, right? And you go, oh, that's over double the performance. But really what you're doing is take 1/4 of 150. So you're rendering at like 37 frames per second and then quadrupling that to 150. It means higher latency, a little bit more sluggish feel on the input. If you're getting above 150 after MFG 4X, I still think it feels okay. If you're dropping below 150 though, it can start to be marginal. All right, that's enough about the overall performance. I want to go through power and efficiency and stuff quickly before we get to the games themselves, which I will run through quickly. So we've got power use. The RTX 5050 is supposed to be a 130 watt TGP, total graphics power. We're generally running just below that, averaging 120, even with the factory overclock. And that's kind of true of most of these cards, that they're not hitting their rated TGP. At 1440p Ultra, power use actually drops even further down to 114. That's because we're running out of VRAM in some of the games, and so all that stuttering and waiting on PCI Express transfers to happen with low performance means the card uses less power. Turn that into efficiency. What do we get? Well, actually the 5050 is pretty much tied with the 9060 XT and also tied with the 4060. It's slightly worse than the 4060 at 1080p medium and the other resolutions as well. Obviously, more VRAM helps the 9060 XT. With DLSS at high settings, the 1440p numbers look way better, but that's not apples to apples, it's just for reference. Clock speeds, to quickly run through those, you get higher clocks from the 5050 than you do from the 5060, 5060 Ti, 4060. Big jump going from the 30 series to the 40 series. Nvidia made some architectural changes to enable higher clock speeds. So even though the 3050 has 20 SMs and the 5050 has 20 SMs, well, you went from 1.9 gigahertz to 2.86 gigahertz, right? That's a huge jump in clock speeds, which is where most of the performance gains come from. If there's 60% better performance overall, it's probably 40 to 50% from clock speeds, and that last 10 to 15% is architectural changes, when we're not factoring in MFG and AI stuff, right? And then we can also talk temperatures. This is just focusing on the Asus Dual card, because 5050 cards are all going to be slightly different based on what the manufacturer does. We're running at around 64 degrees Celsius across all of the settings. That's a good temperature. Like, you don't need to run in the 50s to be safe. You don't want your card to run in the 70s, probably. That means it's getting a little warmer. And if you lived in a desert climate, maybe that would even be bad. But 60 to 70 degrees, all of these cards are fine. That takes care of all of the overall performance data. Let's go ahead and run through the games themselves. I'm just going to talk kind of about the game in general without really focusing on the numbers. You can see the numbers in the charts. Starting with A Quiet Place, The Road Ahead. Uses Unreal Engine 5. Unreal Engine 5 is super popular. It's also super heavy. It adds all these graphical effects that often don't even look that amazing, but they require a lot of memory bandwidth, and compute, and CPU. So it is what it is. We've got the 1080p medium and epic at 1440p and 1080p, and of course DLSS at the upscaled 1440p, which more than triples performance, so that's super useful. Makes the game very playable. Black Myth Wukong, also Unreal Engine 5. Yeah, I know. You're going to hear that like 6 times more. Runs okay at 1080p medium, starts to struggle at the very high setting at 1080p, and that is not the maximum setting. You can go to cinematic, which runs much worse. I think you'd probably get like 20 FPS on the 5050. 1440p, you do get 22 FPS. Again, more than triple that when you turn on DLSS Performance Mode upscaling and drop the quality setting to high, which still looks good. Control Ultimate, this one has ray tracing, and it doesn't support FSR or XeSS, at least if you don't want to try and hack in support via DLLs and other stuff. Runs really well at medium settings, but when you kick on to the new Ultra settings, performance took a major hit. So they released an update in maybe April that added Ultra and Ultra RT, and that really dropped performance on the maxed out settings. DLSS with high more than triples performance again. Actually, I think that more than quadruples performance in this case. So we go from 18 to 85. And a big part of that is because Ultra RT is a lot more demanding than high RT. Cyberpunk 2077, we're getting 40 frames per second at 1080 medium with medium RT effects. Like, it's not the medium RT setting, which is basically ultra plus some medium RT. This is medium settings, and then I turn on ray tracing with medium lighting and reflections without the other 2 lighting options, I think. Lighting and ambient occlusion, maybe. Anyway, I felt that was a good compromise. So 40 frames per second. RT Ultra drops that to 33, and then when we go up to 1440p, we start running out of VRAM on a lot of the cards. You can tell by looking at the 16 gig versus 8 gig cards where those overlap, like the 5060 Ti. High settings, which is high plus all of the RT settings, but it's at medium lighting. With DLSS upscaling, we're back up to 55. Big jump. Dragon Age the Veilguard, this one doesn't benefit as much from DLSS, you'll see in a minute, and there's a lot of swings between lower and higher frame rates. Not micro stutters here or stuttering, it's just like some areas will render at like 45 frames per second on the 5050, and then you walk 10 seconds away and you're rendering at 80, 90 frames per second. The areas of the game world are just very divergent in how much they hit the GPU and CPU and all that stuff. So that's why you'll see like 56 average with a 34 minimum. We basically almost double performance with DLSS and dropping to the high preset in Dragon Age. So not as big like I was saying, because the game is hitting other things like your CPU, and I'm not sure exactly what's limiting performance. Maybe it just doesn't scale as well with DLSS as some other games. Final Fantasy XVI. This is another game that I don't think scales as well with DLSS, but we start out at 44, 43 frames per second for the 5050 and 4060, so a little bit slower on the new card, but basically in the same ballpark. Kick up to the higher settings and performance drops as you would expect, and then at the ultra settings it really drops, and if you turn on DLSS and reduce the settings a bit, you double performance. But none of these cards are getting like super high frame rates. Even the 9060 XT with 16 gig of memory, it's only averaging 70. That's kind of the Final Fantasy XVI engine and everything about the game. It's not a game that's designed to run at really high performance levels. Flight Simulator 2024. Medium settings aren't super demanding and everything does pretty well, but when you kick up to the ultra settings, some of the cards run out of VRAM, which is kind of interesting. Like the 7600 XT does great, 7600 less than half the performance. But the 5060 Ti, 16 gig and 8 gig, they both are within a reasonable distance of each other. So Nvidia didn't run out of memory, AMD did on an 8 gig card. And that applies at 1440p as well. DLSS gives a pretty good performance boost, again, 2.5 times about the level of performance by dropping to high, and 4x upscaling. God of War Ragnarok, interesting thing to point out, the ARC performance there, higher average FPS on the B580, but much worse minimums. There's just like constant micro stutters on Intel in this case, and that applies to all 3 test settings. Also, not a huge benefit from DLSS here. Probably part of that is that there's not as big of a gap between ultra and high in God of War. But yeah, just like you're going from about 50 to about 80. So a 60% improvement for 4x mode upscaling with lower settings. Like, that's pretty negligible if we're being honest. Maybe that's because this one was an AMD promoted game. I don't know. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, going in alphabetical order here. This one requires ray tracing hardware. It doesn't seem to do a lot. It also uses the Vulkan API, Vulkan RT ray tracing. It supports path tracing, which I'm not using because that would just absolutely kill performance. But in just standard mode, it runs pretty well at 1080p medium on everything. Ultra settings, which is what I defaulted to, there's actually like I can't remember off the top of my head, extra ultra, extreme ultra, something like that. There's 2 settings above ultra that require even more VRAM. But even the ultra settings at 1080p exceed 8 gig of VRAM use, and the Nvidia cards just refuse to even run it. AMD's 7600 still gives it a go, but the other Nvidia GPUs fail. And look, the ARC B570 also runs it with 10 gig. I have tested this on an ARC A750, and that also managed to run it. So it seems to be something with Nvidia and the Vulkan RT API where they're just like, hey, it asks for 9 gig of VRAM and I don't have it, so I'm just not even gonna try. Sort of funny. MechWarrior 5, this is another Unreal Engine 5 game. Got a big performance boosting patch back in maybe April or May. Everything improved by, I would say, almost 30%. It was a big change. So there's still hope for Borderlands 4, which is also Unreal Engine 5. It's not part of my test suite, but I'll show some clips of this. The background videos, incidentally, while I'm talking, those are all the DLSS results for the 5050, because I feel like that's kind of the sweet spot for running in it, and I didn't want to try and make dozens of videos with little clips of each one. Even at maximum settings, we're still getting 50 FPS, and of course at 1440p max we drop to 30, but if you drop one setting down to high and turn on DLSS, we're back up to basically where we started. So we went from 86 at 1080p medium native to 88 at 1440p with 4x upscaling and high settings. Monster Hunter Wilds, this is another engine that just does not scale to higher performance levels, kind of like Flight Simulator in a way, but it doesn't look nearly as demanding as it feels. Like, the game doesn't look bad, I'm not saying that, but for how it looks, you'd be like, hey, this should be running at like 150 frames per second. But I think even on like my highest end GPUs, it tops out at, I don't know, I'd have to double check, but maybe 120 or something. It's pretty low. Hits the CPU hard. We're not hitting the CPU limits here. Upscaling, not coincidentally, doesn't help as much here. We go from 36 for 1440p Ultra to only 52 with 1440p high and performance mode upscaling. That's kind of crazy. Spider-Man 2, another game that does tend to like VRAM capacity more. Even at 1080p medium, there's a little bit of a gap between the 8 gig and 16 gig cards that use the same GPU, like the 5060 Ti. At very high settings, which is the maximum, and I'm not enabling RT in this one, just to be clear, we again see like 16 gig cards are definitely benefiting. The 8 gig cards struggle. The 5050 is doing okay, still keeping pace with the 4060. And of course at 1440p, it starts to become a little stuttery. Turning on DLSS and dropping the settings a notch fixes that. Stalker 2, Heart of Chornobyl. Another Unreal Engine 5 game. I know, you're shocked, right? 1080p medium runs okay. This is another game that like it's really demanding on the CPU. Like even on a 5090 running through the village that I'm in for the benchmark, you'll see minimums right around that 60 to 70 FPS mark. Like that's as good as the minimums get. And the maximums, or the averages, I think they top out at like 100 or something without frame generation. That's kind of par for the course for certain Unreal Engine 5 games. Turn up to epic settings, and this is where it gets interesting on the 5050. So the 4060 didn't take a massive performance dump. The 5060 didn't take a massive performance dump, but the 5050 did. Is that because it has 24 megabytes of L2 cache versus 32 megabytes of L2 cache? I wouldn't think that would matter. I think there's maybe just something else going on in the drivers, causes some performance oddities. I mean, it's barely beating the 3050. That's a 4-year-old card. The 7600 also ran out of VRAM, right? But it is interesting that the 5060 Ti didn't. So driver fixes maybe would help there. And at 1440p, well, totally performance collapse on the 5050, which again didn't happen on the 4060 or the 3050. And I tried like a dozen times to get the 5050 to run better. I restarted the game, restarted the computer, cleared drivers, all that stuff, and it didn't help. 5050 just doesn't like Stalker 2 at these settings. Drop down to high, where you reduce the memory requirements, then use DLSS upscaling, and that fixes things in a big way, and now you're getting 67 frames per second. We're basically getting to the end here. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2, second to last game. We're getting 90-ish frames per second, tied with the B580, tied with the 4060, and Arc takes a performance dump on the minimum FPS as we go up to the ultra settings. So there's another one where Intel could do driver work to improve their situation. 8 gig, not a problem for Warhammer Space Marine 2, at least on the Nvidia GPUs and the AMD GPUs. Maybe a bit of a minimum FPS problem on the Arc GPUs. And then lastly, we have Witchfire, which I wanted to end on a bang and use an Unreal Engine 5 game. This one is a less demanding Unreal Engine 5 game. I will say that. It runs a lot higher. Doesn't look like super amazing. The game is made by the people who made Painkiller, I believe, back in the day. 155 frames per second at 1080p medium, drops to 170 at 1080p ultra, and we're still getting 68 at 1440p ultra. Drop to high settings, turn on DLSS, and we, 2.5 times the performance, give or take? Yeah, that's about right. What do I think of the RTX 5050 overall? It's not like a bad card, but it's priced really weird. If this were a $200 card, it'd be great, because then the gap between it and the 5060 is bigger and it makes sense. But right now, as I said at the start, you're getting about 30 to 40% more performance from the 5060 for 20% more money. And that just means like, hey, the 5060 makes more sense. I really wish there were a 12 gig 5060. I mean, it doesn't even need a 192-bit interface. Use the same 3 gigabyte chips that are on the RTX 6000 Pro, that are on the RTX 5090 laptop GPU. But Nvidia didn't want to do that. They wanted market segmentation, and they are just castrating the amount of VRAM. So the 5050 and the 5060 both have 8 gig, but the 5060 has GDDR7 and the 5050 has GDDR6. It's kind of it's a weird thing. Ultimately, the card is okay. If you're bought into the Nvidia DLSS thing, That really helps performance, and it still looks quite good, I think. I don't have a problem with the way DLSS looks. I do have a problem with the frame generation and multi-frame generation marketing. That's a different matter, but DLSS is the gold standard of upscaling. I would still pay the 20% more to get the 5060, or preferably I'd really want a card with 12 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes from Nvidia. That just feels like the future-proof option. The problem is the 5070 is over double the cost of the 5050. Even the 5060 Ti, I think one of them went on sale for under $400 recently, but that's still a $150 upgrade. So if you want more than 8 gig from Nvidia, you're kind of screwed. If you look at the ARC B580, theoretically the same price as the 5050, has 50% more memory, and yet performance is still a wash at 1080p medium, and you don't get DLSS. So it's a better card overall if you don't factor in upscaling. But if you factor in upscaling, I think the 5050 makes a strong case for itself. That's it. Thanks for watching. Please support my channel, like and subscribe. This is totally independent. No one's paying me to do this. My YouTube channel doesn't have enough subscribers for me to get paid yet, so please help change that. And let me know what else you'd like to see tested. Oh, I didn't show this. Borderlands 4. Let's show the Borderlands 4 performance. Don't have charts for this because I haven't benchmarked it on a bunch of things. Unreal Engine 5 again. 1080p medium. Native scaling. Already using basically 8 gig of VRAM. The 5050 is at its limit. You go to 1080p high and it starts to stutter badly. Even with 1440p high plus upscaling from 720p, it still ran out of memory and stuttered. So if you're thinking about the future, this is where 8 gigabyte cards are a problem. Hopefully Borderlands 4 can get some patches out that improve the performance, just like I saw with MechWarrior 5 Clans, but we'll have to wait and see. So again, thanks for watching. Let me know what you want to see tested in the future. I still need to get a 9060 XT 8 gig, and I need to do some other reviews. Take care.